A veil of mist draped the valley, where snow-crusted branches reached skyward like ancient fingers frozen mid-prayer. The world was silent, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. In the grainy light of dawn, a herd of primal mammals edged across the frost-stung basin, their breath rising in ghostly plumes. Cracks in the frozen soil whispered of something long held beneath, a secret older than memory, buried beneath centuries of ash and silence. Fires burned dimly in distant caves, casting flickering shadows against ancient stone, while a single figure stood watching the distant mountains, motionless amid the bitter wind. What had silenced this vast living world so completely? And why had nature drawn its breath, only to hold it for 1,000 millennia? In the age before names, before maps, 1,000 winters ago, the spine of the world trembled beneath a shifting sky. Vast glaciers groaned as they crawled across land like living monuments of ice, carving valleys and swallowing rivers into silence. Herds of towering herbivores moved with solemn purpose, their migration paths etched in instinct rather than memory, vanishing and reappearing like ghosts through blizzards that howled like mourning spirits. Inland, towering forests, once rich with life, now stood brittle and skeletal, their canopies frozen mid-motion, as if time itself had paused. Beneath this vast, frozen hush, predators watched from the shadows, eyes glinting with adaptations honed by unforgiving cycles of hunger and dusk. The earth was not dead, but it was holding its pulse, preparing for something immense. Even the stars, veiled by low, thick clouds, seemed to wait in silence. Who, or what, could survive when even the seasons refused to return? Along the edges of ancient ridgelines, early hominins moved like slow shadows between the boulders, their fire-warmed eyes scanning the open ice fields for movement. Their lives hinged on instinct, and the shrewd knowledge passed through generations, not by language, but through gesture and mimicry. They had no names for the changing winds, no myths yet carved into bone or whisper, but they recognized the weight in the air. The cold cut deeper, lingered longer. Hunts were growing riskier, prey scarcer. Nights stretched endlessly, and even the fires, fed with dwindling stores of dried wood, seemed reluctant to burn. To survive meant evolving with the ice, or perishing beneath it. Above them, a sky flushed pale with frozen breath marked the beginning of a reckoning, not written on stone or skin, but on the shifting face of a planet that no longer moved to the rhythm it once kept. In the heart of a glacial basin, now silenced by wind and blanketed in dim snowlight, rival groups of early humans approached separate fates. To the west, near the precipice of a thawing riverbed, a lineage clad in crude hides hunched over flint shards and knuckled carcasses, their rituals bound by habit more than hope. They were quiet folk, built compact against the cold, with sinewed limbs and eyes like carved obsidian. People shaped by the grinding geometry of scarcity. Far across the white void, another clan emerged, taller, restless, with narrower faces and quicker strides. They moved in clusters of 5s and 7s, braiding grasses into traps and casting long-limbed silhouettes across the ever-dimming snow. These were not yet species apart, nor fully aligned, but between them stretched a growing divergence, in breath, in bone, in strategy. Clashes were rare but loaded with consequence, for each encounter mirrored a greater fracture blooming beneath them. As the glaciers shifted underfoot, two inherited paths began to part. not with violence, but with silence, as survival chose differently where language had not yet dared. Beneath the still canopy of snow, time sculpted destinies with cold precision. The taller lineage traversed the barren landscape with restless hunger, tracking the fading scent of hooved prey that had grown erratic in migration. They adapted quickly, twisting sinew into hunting cords, shaping tools with flint finer than their ancestors had dared. They read the land like breath once held and now exhaled, sensing heat where others felt only absence. To the west, the older kind leaned inward, conserving energy, clinging to shrinking reserves and routines forged in a different era. They spoke in firelight glances, shared marrow not as family, but necessity. And the chasm widened not just in distance, but in rhythm, a dance out of sync with itself. The wind carried fragrances of rot and ash, a warning that the land's patience had limits. Ice groaned beneath the rising humidity of a world confused by its own turning. Something deep below, something slumbering, began to stir. Not a beast, but a shift. An unraveling of balances so ancient, none living remembered a time they were whole. Far to the north, where the sun skimmed the horizon like a blade of dull copper, the ice spoke in fractures. Cracks ran through the permafrost with slow urgency, echoing through the bones of the land like thunder trapped inside stone. It began subtly, almost reverently, with the melting of a single glacier tongue, which bled into ancient ravines long acquainted with drought. But the water carried memories old as the sky. It stirred the soil, softened cliffs, and summoned long-buried spores into fragile awakenings. Small signs at first, patches of moss where once there was only frost, and then birds, long absent, skimming low with uncertain calls. Yet with each bloom, another rhythm faltered. The rains came too soon, then not at all. Herds turned disoriented, misaligning their ancient migrations. And beneath it all, the delicate braid of coexistence began to unravel. This was not the rebirth the land had expected, nor the creatures within it, but a convulsion. Slow yet relentless, as if the earth, in forgetting how to breathe, had begun instead to blink, uncertain of what world would still be here when its eyes next opened. Among the foothills shadowed between collapsing ice cliffs, the ground itself seemed to hum with a tension older than time. One evening, as the dim sun dipped beneath a sky the color of tarnished bone, the younger clan halted in a ravine lined with blistered stone. They could feel it, the change. The air no longer stung from cold alone, but carried a dampness, unfamiliar and almost sweet, that clung to their lungs like memory. Fires no longer crackled the same way. Dry wood hissed and spat, resisting flame as if the rules had shifted beneath the surface of the world. The elders among them, though few, began to murmur of old paths closed, of echoes returned unanswered. Prey was not just harder to track, it vanished entirely, as if swallowed. The scent of predators lingered without bodies, and even insects no longer carved their usual songs into the silence. All signs pointed inward, downward, towards something unseen but pulling imperceptibly. A turning of something colossal. Not a storm, not a beast, something more final. It was as if the earth had stopped exhaling, and every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for the beat that would never come. From the high ledges overlooking the ravine, a child of the taller clan stared long into the mist. his fingers tightening instinctively around a stone tool shaped more like a question than an answer. Below him, the silence had deepened into something raw and total. A silence that seemed to echo the absence of movement, of ritual, of future. Around him, the elders debated paths not only across land, but within memory, sensing that the wisdom of their kind had begun to unravel, thread by thread. The forest no longer spoke. The ice no longer warned before it broke. The wind had turned inward, drawing the sounds of the world into itself like lungs preparing for one final, forgotten sigh. In that stillness, between breath and silence, the child blinked, and for the briefest moment, he imagined the earth whispering its last before sleep, not as an ending, but as an emptiness waiting to be filled again. The question was not whether life would return, but in what shape and under what sun it would remember how to begin again. High above, where the tree line once stretched, the southern ice began to whisper its own secrets. A rare thaw exposed shelves of once frozen earth, revealing the fossilized bones of beasts that had not walked in generations, their ivory limbs twisted like petitions to forgotten skies. From the bones, spores rose like dust and settled in the lungs of the unwary. Illness swept quietly, without drama. No fevers, no blood, just a slow stalling of breath, a gradual stilling of limbs. Among the Western group, once thought immutable, coughs began to pass like shared fire. Eyes dulled, movements slowed. One by one, they vanished from their own rhythms, not buried, but absorbed by the land. There were no words to mark their loss, only missing glances and blocked trails. The other group watched from afar, uncertain whether what ailed the others was the wrath of ancestors or the earth's own sentence passed in silence. Neither side truly understood, but both knew this place had shifted. This world no longer belonged to instinct. It belonged to something quieter, colder, and far more patient. Through the thick breath of the thawing lowlands, the last vestiges of habit gave way to improvisation. The remaining humans no longer followed trails, but wandered loosely, guided more by feeling than foresight. The young collected stones not for tools, but for the comfort of weight in their palms. The elders whispered fewer memories, as if the earth no longer called for remembering. Trees, twisted by sudden warmth and sudden frost, leaned in absurd ways, growing sideways before splitting open from within. Rivers overflowed and ran backward through ancient channels, stirring up silt rich with dormant memories, spores, seeds, contagions. It was a landscape jagged with broken time. Nothing arrived when expected, nothing left quite the right way. And in the growing quietness, not of death, but of suspension, all things, moss, bone, breath, drifted slowly toward stillness. Beneath the soil, beneath the cold, the planet had shifted its core, not in anger, but in exhaustion. The great pause had begun, not as apocalypse, but as negation. 1,000,000 years ago, the earth stopped breathing, but not forever, only long enough to forget what it once was, and to begin, quietly, again. Days turned indistinguishable from nights, defined only by the depth of shadow and the changes in wind. In one hollow, tucked beneath a crescent of shale and ice, a gathering of survivors tried to shape meaning out of the drift. They carved symbols into soft bark with charcoal, not out of tradition but compulsion, swirling shapes that mirrored the frozen eddies in the streams or the spiral seen in the pupil of a dying beast. Smoke rose in thinner ribbons, food burned more easily, and dreams grew louder. Some spoke of the stars dancing above the clouds, others of faces in stone hollows or music beneath the lake ice. Their bodies remained grounded in the struggle, but their minds began to stretch toward stories that grew not from necessity, but from silence. Without knowing it, they were inventing memory. And memory, in the still furnace of the earth's long, breathless slumber, became the only anchor left between past and future. That was the seed that would be carried beyond the frost, beyond the unknown. Not a weapon, not a map, but myth, taking root in a world preparing to open its eyes once more. Far beyond the whispering lakes and shattered forests, where time folded tighter in the blue gloom of deep caves, a new rhythm began to pulse. It was faint, near imperceptible at first, like the flicker of a heart forgotten in stillness. Beneath layers of stone, insulated from the chaos above, a small band of survivors discovered permanence not in fire or tools, but in presence. They remained, not because they conquered, but because they endured, moving less, listening more. The walls around them became scrolls of breath and soot, adorned with spirals and handprints pressed like vows into the cold. This was not ceremony. It was memory externalized, a gesture against the eventual erasure. Outside, the world continued its long, slumbering bend toward rebirth, but within those walls, the story lingered in ember and pigment. A question unanswered circled those stones. When the earth awakens once more, will it remember us as we were, or only through what we dared to leave behind in the silence? Above the deep caverns and brittle plateaus, the sky itself began its slow confession. Clouds unraveled into thinning streaks and reformed into strange geometries never seen before. Neither summer nor winter, neither storm nor rest. Winds circled unnaturally, looping through ridgelines as if seeking something lost. It was here, in this liminal stillness, that the first song returned. Not sung by lips, but carried in the rhythm of footfalls on softened soil, in the hush of fire kindled without wood, in the pulse of breath sinking once more with the air around it. A girl, scarcely more than bone and thought, pressed her palm into the cave wall beside the older prince. Her breath steamed, and for a moment the chamber shimmered not with heat, but history. She did not know if others would follow, or find what had been left behind. But in that pressed hand, in that motionless moment before the wind shifted again, the earth exhaled, slowly, shallowly, but surely. Not as the end of silence, but its reply. A single breath, shared across stone and shadow, rising at last from sleep. The girl stood in the lingering warmth of her own breath, eyes open not to color or shape, but to feeling. Behind her, the cave was quiet, alive only in memory and echo. Before her, the world teetered on the edge of itself, not in cataclysm, but in hesitation. The earth had not screamed as it fell quiet, nor would it roar as it began to stir again. It would whisper, then murmur, then move. In her, and those who would come after her, seed by seed, step by step, the long silence would be answered. Not in triumph, but in continuity. The earth does not forget, not entirely. It simply waits. And as her hand fell from the stone, dust lifted in the slant of dawnlight, catching the light like the breath of the world itself, returned not with certainty, but with possibility. From stillness, something stirred. From absence, a beginning. Not a return to what was, but a quiet promise. Life would find shape again. And in the pattern of that breath, the earth remembered how to be alive. Beneath windswept canopies of ice-laced pine, the survivors moved not to conquer, but to listen. They followed rivers that trickled again, searching for signs not just of food or warmth, but of intention. Markings in stone, patterns in wind, echoes that suggested the world was beginning, ever so faintly, to speak again. Birds returned in pairs, nervous and tentative, their songs incomplete, as though remembering only fragments of an older melody. Ferns unfurled in curl-headed defiance, pushing upward through the ash of centuries. And dusk brought colors back to the horizon, not yet vibrant, but layered like a bruise healing across a vast sky. Measured and slow, the breath of earth pushed outward, re-inhabiting the hollows it had once abandoned. And those few who remained at its surface, quiet, weathered and unspeaking, bore witness to a truth deeper than myth, that even silence ends, that even stillness prepares. In that staggering calm after 1,000,000 years of drift and waiting, Earth remembered motion, and the descendants of forgotten clans took their first steps again, not toward dominance, but resonance, their bodies echoing the planet's long-awaited inhale. Cradled within a newly softened valley, where fog clung low and persistent, a pulse returned, slow, rhythmic, as if testing the old boundaries of breath. Pools formed where permafrost once reigned, mirroring the pale sky and the cautious movements of animals returning from untraceable distances. Above them, the silhouettes of those who had endured tracked these changes with reverence, not strategy. They touched the trunks of trees with fingers outstretched, not to strip bark, but to feel life. Beneath their feet, roots stirred and cracked frost with subtle defiance. No one spoke of survival anymore, because survival had already passed its test. What remained now was presence. And in that presence, a truth that outlived names. The earth had exhaled. Gently, deeply, with the relief of something rediscovering its own rhythm. And in that breath, the world was born not again, but differently, shaped by silence, awakened by continuity, and remembered only in the quiet footsteps of those who chose to listen before they moved. On the slope where frost met thaw, a boy from the cliff-dwelling kind crouched beside a rivulet slicing through the softened stone. The stream was shallow but clear, and within it swayed strands of green not seen in generations. He traced the water's path with his eyes, then dipped his fingers in, startled not by cold, but by motion. The current's tug was gentle, alive, persistent. He looked up to the ridge where others still waited, their silhouettes small against the slowly shifting sky, and felt, no, knew, that something long paused had begun again. Not with fire, not with tools, but with awareness. Around him, the valley breathed a little deeper, shadows fell a little softer. Above, a flock of birds began a crooked V across the pale heavens, hesitating once before continuing their flight. In that hesitation was carried the entire memory of stillness, now finally let go. And in the boy's breath, mingling with mist and memory, the earth stretched, not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to begin again. Enough to remember. The days that followed bore no defining act, no burst of glory, only gestures. the slow kind that root deeper than fire or speech. A man lifted his face to the warmth of new sun among branches dripping melt. A mother turned over soil with her hands, black and rich for the first time in uncountable seasons. Children walked instinctually beside streams, stacking white stones in spirals that mimicked what lingered faintly in their dreams. All around them, the earth did not rush. It swelled and settled, casting off silence not with thunder, but with patience. And in that stretch of day and dark and day again, something eternal gave way to change. The earth, hemmed in long breathlessness, had remembered its own rhythm, not to roar, but to hum, not to reclaim, but to allow. And for those who remained, every step forward was not toward dominion, but into the fidelity of a world relearning to live. The million years of hush had ended not with awakening, but with remembering. A breath held, now finally released, and in its slow exhale, everything began. Beneath a canopy of mist and budding green, dawn stretched its quiet limbs across hills once buried under eons of frost. The air, no longer brittle, now shimmered faintly with damp promise. From a grove ringed with the echoes of generations, elders gathered in silence, their bodies marked by the softened lines of long endurance. They did not speak because none of what they felt could be named. Not hope, not grief, but something more primitive, like soil remembering how to cradle roots. One leaned forward, drawing a symbol in the soft earth with a bare finger. Not a map, but a pulse. Around them, the forest listened. The wind carried old songs in broken hums, and as the sun rose past a horizon no longer frozen, its light spilled not as fire, but as memory reborn in gold. The earth had breathed again, not loudly, not suddenly, but completely. And all that moved within it shared that breath. Whatever came next would be shaped not by survival, but by harmony. One step, one seed, one silence at a time. In that grove, where memory lifted like mist, a child knelt beside the newly drawn symbol. Her fingers hovered just above the soil, trembling not from cold, but from awareness, as if she could feel the ground itself pulsing faintly beneath her skin. Around her, the silence held a different weight now, no longer warning, but listening. Leaves stirred in crisp patterns overhead, speaking not in language, but in rhythm. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm over the mark, completing what the elder had begun. In that instant, without sound, the earth received her gesture. It was not history or prophecy. It was connection, unrecorded yet enduring. And as her breath joined the breeze twisting gently through the grove, it carried with it the quiet revelation that all life had been waiting for. Not a return to what once was, but arrival into what could be, shaped by those still willing to remember the silence and step gently through its echo. Across the range where glaciers once ruled like sleeping colossi, the land now bore textures unfamiliar to even the stones themselves. Lichens patterned the exposed rock like skin reclaiming a wounded body, while the air no longer moved with threat, but with invitation. In a sheltered valley, where echoes took longer to fade, shapes moved with neither fear nor dominance. They were few, these bearers of breath, but steady, their every action a reply to the long stillness they had survived. One of them knelt at the edge of a pool, treacle thick with life, watching as delicate creatures skated its surface undisturbed. He dipped a hand into the warmth that had once been fatal cold, and whispered, not in words, but through presence. We are still here. And in that pause, in that contact between hand and water and heartbeat and soil, the earth listened in full, exhaling not from lungs, but from memory. The silence was finally over. What awoke did not roar. It pulsed, it grew, it endured. And from that breath, the world, not as it was, but as it could be, began to unfold. In the days that followed, light seeped more boldly through once muted skies, reaching places that had been untouched by warmth for epochal spans. Along a high ridge where winds used to scream without rhythm, grasses now bent in gentle synchrony, their blades catching and scattering light like shattered glass made soft by time. The clan walked beside this ancient path with wonder pressed into every footfall, not speaking, not out of loss, but from reverence. They knew, without knowing how, that they were no longer surviving history, but stepping beyond it. Beneath their calloused souls, the soil no longer felt foreign. It yielded, welcomed, remembered. A new age had arrived, not with fanfare, but through breath, bone, and the unspoken resilience of those who had waited long in the dark. And as the sun passed its zenith and shadows stretched ahead, they moved onward, their silence no longer empty, but full, of meanings unspoken, of lives reimagined, of earth rediscovered, one tender breath at a time. As twilight laid a golden hush across the highland ridges, a stormless calm settled over the reshaped world. Creatures newly emerged from their slumbers drank cautiously at streams stirred by thaw, sensing not danger, but invitation. The descendants of those first breathers, once fractured, now interwoven, gathered in a ring around the coals of an evening fire. There were no chants, no customs carried forward unbroken, only the profound stillness of a people who had inherited survival and grown into presence. One elder, her brow tufted with gray like the rocks, reached forward and touched ash to forehead, not as a rite, but as acknowledgement, of pain endured, of silence kept, of breath restored. Around her, the young watched, not to mimic, but to witness. And as night deepened across the firmament and stars emerged slow and deliberate, the earth did not roar its rebirth. It breathed, as it always had, as it always would. And those who remained did not shape its memory. They became it. One breath, infinite, quietly returned. Time rippled onward, not in hours or seasons, but in breath and gesture. In the cradle of a gently warming basin, where mist curled like forgotten lullabies, two children faced one another. One held a branch still wet with sap, the other clutched a smoothed stone, etched by water and time. Neither spoke. Instead, their meeting formed something older than language, a witnessing. They reached toward one another slowly, not to trade or test, but to share the moment carved between stillness and renewal. Above them, the sky bruised toward night as the wind turned mild and constant, like a song once forgotten, now humming faintly from the bones of the world. It was not a grand return, nor was it ever meant to be, but in that gesture, hand outstretched, breath shared, silence joined, the earth completed its cycle, not in fire, but in memory, not in might, but in meaning. And deep within its ancient core, the planet exhaled fully, gently, and without sorrow. For at last, life had remembered how to listen. And in that listening, everything began again. In a hollowed ravine shaped by melt and memory, a lone flame flickered beside a cluster of slate stones, its light reaching upward as though beckoning the stars into witness. Nearby, a woman sat cross-legged, her breath steady, slow, filling the space once held only by shadow. In her lap lay an unshaped piece of wood, and beside it, a stone blade dulled by use. She was not carving symbols this time, but feeling. The grain, the way it resisted and yielded. Around her, the night did not feel empty anymore. It felt vast, ready. The earth beneath cradled her weight without protest, and in the hush between her inhale and the breeze rustling dry twigs beyond, the truth lived quietly. That what had paused had also healed. That what had slept had not forgotten. And as her fingers traced the wood's surface like a memory once lost to ice, the flame beside her steadied. This new world would be slow to name itself, but it would know breath, it would know time, and it would begin again, not through thunder, but through touch, silence, and the unbreakable rhythm of living remembered. Across the slope from where forgotten glaciers once ruled, a boy and an elder stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing down a valley painted in morning mist. They said nothing, though their breaths drifted together, visible like spirits moving forward without fear. Below, the land pulsed in clarity. Streams shimmered, stones gleamed with dew, and the silhouette of animals moved without wariness, as if memory itself had grown gentle. The elder pointed not with command, but with curiosity, his hand tracing the flight of a small bird that darted across the open sky. The boy watched, eyes wide, as if glimpsing the answer to a question not yet asked. Around them, the world continued to unfold with patient grace, stitched together by every breath that had been held, every silence that had been honored. There would be stories carved, steps taken, names given in time. But for now, what endured was the feeling that the earth, once stilled by forces beyond measure, had found its rhythm again. And in the heartbeat of this new beginning, nothing was forgotten, only transformed. The breath had been returned, and with it, the world was whole. Above the valley where frost once ruled, and silence had shaped the soul of the land, a soft wind coursed down from unseen heights, carrying with it a presence too ancient to name. Along a ridge dusted with dew and echoed memory, the last embers of night surrendered to a sun now fully reborn, not hot, but whole. A line of wanderers moved slowly across the slope, their shadows long and joined like roots stretching toward unknown soil. They did not look back. There was nothing left behind to mourn, only the deep knowing carried in each step that they were not beginning anew, but continuing something vast. As a child at the rear paused and turned her face to the breeze, her hair lifted, and for a moment there was nothing but her breath, slow, attuned, and open. It was not survival that guided her now, nor fear. It was resonance. And as she walked forward once more, into light and wind and the song of returning birds, the earth exhaled again through her, through all of them, not once, but forever. A breath unbroken at last. In the distance, where fog hugged the base of rising hills and the air shimmered faintly with the breath of thawing stone, The first fires of a new settlement were kindled. Not out of desperation or defense, but out of rhythm. A quiet declaration that place was once again possible. Around them, the earth pulsed not in urgency, but in invitation. Children laughed without caution, chasing each other between glints of moss-covered rock, and elders placed stones in rings not to ward, but to remember. The sky, now broad and open, held no omens, only light stretching forward. What once staggered under extinction now stood, soft and resolute. No one spoke of what was lost, because it lived in everything present, in warmth, in soil, in the near-forgotten gesture of one hand reaching for another. The breath once halted had returned fully, woven through limb and landscape alike. And as embers floated toward stars no longer occluded, the earth settled its story. Not sealed in finality, but carried ever forward in the quiet, glorious inhale of life, unforgotten. In that new light, where warmth no longer felt like trespass, and time flowed like water thawed from ancient stillness, the inhabitants of this reawakened world did not rebuild. They wove. Wove from silence, from breath, from gestures remembered between generations untouched by language. The land responded, not with bounty or ease, but with consent, letting itself be known again little by little, root by root. Along the banks of a slow-moving river, a figure knelt to trace the pattern of reeds bending to wind, not as a task, but as reverence. Behind them, others moved in quiet motion, tending fires, touching stone, nodding toward birds whose songs had once been absent for ages. No monuments rose, no victories claimed. Only this, a living world, not recollected or resurrected, but rejoined. And as night returned, not with threat, but with hush, the valley exhaled one final breath of memory into the sky. The pause, the endless hush, the million-year breath. It had not meant to end anything. It had waited, and now it listened. And wrapped in that listening, life continued, steady as flame, soft as ash, strong as breath returned. And so, beneath skies that no longer held back their stars, and upon a land no longer defined by silence, the world moved. Not fast, not loud, but undeniably forward. In every stream that flowed across once barren soils, in every hand that brushed against bark, in every shared glance between those who walked without fear, the breath of earth lived anew. This was not a beginning, nor an ending, but a remembering of what it meant to be part of the pulse, not apart from it. Life, patient and boundless, did not announce its return. It simply continued. And as the wind carried the scent of new blossoms through valleys once smothered in frost, a single truth echoed across stone and sinew and spirit alike. The earth had not died 1,000,000 years ago. It had only paused, waiting until the world was ready to listen. And now, beneath the endless hush of twilight, where mist curled through the low canyons like the earth's own sleeping breath, the final embers of silence faded completely. A child crouched beneath a blooming tree, its petals pale as forgotten snowflakes, yet warm to the touch, and scooped a handful of soil between calloused fingers. It was dark, rich, alive. Around her, figures moved slowly, not building from blueprints, but from echoes, letting each movement be guided by what the wind suggested, what the roots allowed. The long silence, the breath held in ice and dusk, had not been a warning, but a preparation. A space cleared for the world not to return, but to become. Time, like sunlight through leaves, now gave shape to wonder. And as the valley filled with fires kindled from memory and hands joined across forgotten bloodlines, the earth, no longer waiting, no longer whispering, spoke through every footstep, every sigh, every shared pulse. We are home. Not again, but finally. In the quiet that followed the long return, the earth lay neither tamed nor restored, but simply awake. Animals moved along ridgelines with renewed rhythm, not driven by fear, but by the sheer inheritance of presence. Streams carved new paths through softened ground, their gurgle a language older than words, and saplings tilted their leaves toward skies unfamiliar but promising. In one sun-dappled clearing, a circle formed, not for ritual nor survival, but recognition. Those who had come through the stillness met one another's eyes and held that gaze, not to question, but to confirm. Yes, we are here. The breath once lost, once frozen and suspended in the deepest chambers of earth and time, had returned not as victory, but as harmony. Life no longer rushed, it resonated, and in its rhythm lived the echo of a million-year silence that had shaped every stone, every scar, every seed. The earth no longer waited, it welcomed. And in that welcome, the final breath turned fully outward at last, whole, living, and home. At the edge of a glowing marsh, where mist clung to water lilies and frogs sang the first true chorus of the new epoch, the final ember of the earth's long silence blinked gently into nothingness. A woman, bent with years but unshaken in presence, stepped barefoot into the warm shallows, her reflection rippling outward in quiet affirmation. In her arms, she carried a woven basket, not of necessity, but of offering, filled with seeds gathered not only from soil, but from memory. Around her, no watchers stood, yet she was seen by the trees, by the wind, by the world that had waited with her. She scattered the seeds across the water's surface, each one cradled in breath, in silence once held and now relinquished. As they drifted, so too did the unspoken story of all that had passed, from ice to ash to green again. No voice named this moment, no hand recorded it, yet it was known deeply. The earth, which once held its breath for 1,000,000 years, now exhaled in full. And in that breath, not loud or proud, but sacred in its gentleness, life answered, "We are ready." Wherever the wind carried those seeds, so too went the future, born not on conquest, but on care. The story was complete, not because it ended, but because it had finally begun. And so the breath, held in frost and stars, in stone and silence, found its rest not in finality, but in presence, steady, quiet, and whole. In every child's laughter, echoing beside a stream that once ran dry, in every elder's steady step across moss-soft soil, the earth remembered not just how to live, but how to be lived with. No longer fractured, no longer hurried, the rhythm moved through every root and ripple, every leaf and lung. There were no monuments, no rulers, no songs etched grandly across cliffside, only moments, shared breaths, quiet steps. And as dusk bled gently into night for the 1,000th time since the stillness ended, a single flame danced atop a hill, surrounded by calm. It flickered not against the dark, but with it, a sign that everything sacred had endured. The earth breathed, fully and forever, not as it once was, but as it was always meant to be. And with that, the story rests, not forgotten, not finished, but folded carefully into the heartbeat of the world itself, waiting again for those who will listen. And somewhere, deep beneath layers of sediment and time, far from firelight and footprints, the earth held the imprint of that breath, sealed in pollen, in pigment, in the quiet spiral of a shell buried long ago. It waited not as a relic, but as a remnant of what endurance can become when allowed to breathe again. In time, these fragments would rise to the surface, unearthed by other hands in distant epochs, hands that would marvel and wonder and listen closely, unaware that the same breath guiding their wonder once warmed the lungs of those who survived the long hush. The great silence had passed, but its memory lingered, not in sorrow, but in balance. A reminder that the earth does not live by noise, nor power, nor haste. It lives by breath, by stillness, by the decision to go on. And so it does, endlessly, lovingly, in cycles seeded not only by life, but by the long patience of those who chose to wait, to whisper, and to begin again. Thus, the earth turned once more, not with violence or proclamation, but as a continuation of breath long remembered. From the faint stirrings in soil to the glint in a child's eye beside a fire never meant to guard, but to gather, the world reclaimed its rhythm. No witness remained of the first stillness, and none would remain of the last. But the story, etched without pen, woven without thread, carried forward through gesture, wind, and hum. It was a story of breath regained, of silence revered, of life spoken not through conquest, but through closeness. Across forests reborn and rivers redirected by memory, those who had listened now lived. And the earth, its chest risen once more with the gentle effort of remembering, held steady in that pulse. Not to speak again, but to remain spoken. And in the spaces between footfall and ash, between mist and promise, the breath of 1,000,000 years settled not in ending, but in echo, infinite, enduring, and alive. And beyond the hills, where dusk held longer than day, where memory drifted in the breeze like forgotten songs, the story untangled itself from time. What began in frost and fire, in silence and fear, had endured, not through dominion, but through devotion. A rhythm eternal spun through the grass, through the hands planting seeds with no promise but presence. In the hush that was no longer absence but reverence, the earth sang. A song without melody, carried in the breath of all things willing to listen. There was no need now for names or markings, only the pulse of steps taken with care. And as the stars broke clean over a sky unburdened by smoke or sorrow, the breath that had been held for 1,000,000 years did not vanish. It lived on, shared, steady, infinite. Not history, not prophecy, simply life, remembered perfectly in the silence that followed, and the breath that, finally, never had to stop again. And so, high atop a wind-brushed plateau, where stone met sky and silence braided itself into air, the cycle closed. No monument rose, no farewell was spoken. A single figure, neither young nor old, neither past nor future, stood with souls pressed to warm stone, the breath in their chest rising slow, deep, complete. Around them, grasses rustled in patterns older than time, and the earth below pulsed faintly, as though humming to itself a lullaby it had always known. The sky, brushed lavender by the coming night, stretched wide with acceptance, holding stars not as mysteries, but as memories. In this final stillness, shared by root and cloud, by heartbeat and breeze, the earth breathed, once, fully, and forever. And in the quiet that followed, complete and true, a story older than sound found its rest, not in final words, but in the unbroken rhythm of life that simply continued.
Somewhere deep in the softened marrow of the earth, beneath layers of stone warmed once more by the sun's insistent reach, a breath continued, slow, patient, learned. Life no longer raced ahead of catastrophe. It danced beside the quiet, cradled by cycles that unspooled not for conquest, but for connection. Above, people moved across the land as part of it, not apart from it, pausing now and then not to remember what came before, but to listen for what might still be speaking. In these pauses, beneath the spreading shadow of a tree that had once known only frost, a child laid down beside a pool, hand outstretched to trace the ripples. The water moved, steady and fine, and her breath synced with it. She did not call this peace, nor did she need to. The earth had held its breath for 1,000,000 years. But now, at last, unmistakably, irreversibly, it breathed not just again, but with them. And the silence that once meant ending now carried only this: belonging. And beneath the soil where ash had mingled with memory and roots grew in cradles of once buried stillness, the earth pulsed one final time into fullness. No more waiting, no more shadows cast by the breathless dark. From cave to canopy, from stream to sky, every living shape joined the rhythm set long ago in silence, now freed at last into motion. There was nothing left to rediscover, only to remember, slowly, communally, endlessly. As wind swept gently through the last untouched glade, stirring leaves like the pages of an unwritten book, all that was left unsaid settled into the land itself. The earth had exhaled fully. It asked for nothing. It offered everything. And in the heart of that great, quiet completion, life moved forward. Not as a beginning, but as the living continuation of breath once held, now returned, now eternal. And in that last breath, drawn gently from a world once folded in shadow, the earth arrived not at a conclusion, but at communion. No fissures remained between silence and speech, between stillness and movement. Everything now flowed, sustained not by effort, but by harmony. In a clearing lit by neither fire nor sun, but by the simple glow of breath made visible through presence, a young voice hummed a melody with no origin and no end. Around her, grass swayed, insects stirred, waters layered their rhythm beneath her song. Nothing grand was spoken, yet everything was said. The 1,000,000-year hush had not been a wound, but a witnessing. And now, across the curve of a quiet, resuming planet, life rose gently into its fullness. The earth, whole in breath and memory, had become its own language. And those who walked beneath its skies
no longer searched for meaning in sound or stone. They lived it, step by step, breath by breath, the living inheritance of silence, transformed into song.
High above the lowlands, where rivers now shimmered with newborn clarity, a final scene unfolded in stillness, wrapped not in farewell, but arrival. An elder leaned against a tree, whose bark bore grooves from 1,000 seasons, now soft with moss. Around him, younger voices echoed gently across the hills, not in celebration, but in reverence for presence itself. He smiled softly, not for what was said, but for what was understood. The land no longer asked to be tamed, and the people no longer sought to rule. In every step taken without haste, in every fire built from memory rather than need, the earth exhaled again and again, a rhythm forged in silence and carried in breath. There would be no more grand reckonings here, only this enduring truth. But what endured was never power, but patience. And as the elder closed his eyes, and the wind moved past like a final lullaby, the story, long held and gently told, came to rest. The breath once paused for 1,000,000 years, now flowed forward, infinite and unbroken, written not in words, but in the living world itself. So it was that the earth, once stilled by frost and silence, turned again beneath skies no longer burdened by sorrow. From the roots that reached down into darkness to the stars scattered across the canopy of night, everything breathed together. No longer fractured, the world had found its rhythm in the soft, relentless motion of life, persisting not despite what had come before, but because of it. And in the hush that followed, in the unfurling of leaves and the crunch of footsteps moving gently across soil both ancient and new, a final truth remained. When the earth stopped breathing, it waited. When it exhaled, it remembered. And now, with every pulse of wind and whisper of water, that breath continues, not forgotten, not alone, but carried forward forever in the quiet strength of those who listened and lived. In the twilight hush, as stars bled gently down the vault of dusk, a final moment lingered across the trembling skin of the world. A child stood alone on a rise above the glimmering river, a single reed flute pressed to her lips, shaped not by hands that sought to impress, but to remember. A melody rose, simple, breath-born, ancient before it had ever been played. It was a song not of loss or hope, but of recognition, that silence had been a teacher, and the breath that followed it was sacred. Around her, the land did not respond with flourish or miracle, but with stillness, as if even the earth, wide awake now, paused to listen. Each note vanished into darkness like sparks into a night sky, but none were lost. They were absorbed, welcomed, returned. The child lowered her flute. No one clapped. No one needed to. For in that quiet, held by sky and soil alike, the final echo of 1,000,000-year silence faded, not into emptiness, but into belonging. The earth breathed fully now, and would never forget how again. And so, in that place where time had once stood still, the earth held steady and alive, its breath now a constant heartbeat beneath every stone and sky. No thunder marked the close, no final flame or voice rose above the quiet, only a world resolute in its return. Forests expanded slowly, guided not by urgency, but by memory traced in vein and sunbeam. Humanity,
scattered and humble, did not rise to reshape the land, but to walk beside it, leaving only footprints, only songs. 1,000 seasons would come and pass, and in each one, the long-held silence would echo not as ruin, but as foundation. For when silence reigns long enough, it teaches not emptiness, but reverence. And now, as night folded gently around the rim of the valley, and one last breeze carried through the trees like the closing chord of an ancient hymn, the earth, once breathless, no longer waited. It simply lived, with them, for them, because of them, breathing at last, without end. And there, upon the crest of an emerald rise, where dawn spilled gold over stone and fern alike, one final step was taken. A young figure, face lit by the warmth of a sun that no longer feared to shine, bent low to place a smooth stone atop a quiet cairn. It was not an act of mourning, nor even memory, but gratitude. For what had held still, for what had endured, for what had chosen not to speak until the world was ready to listen. No ceremony followed, no proclamations echoed across the land. Only the wind moved, cool and steady, brushing past as if to say, "This is enough." The earth, once a breath held so long it nearly forgot itself, no longer strained against time. It simply existed, fiercely alive, fully heard. And as the child stood and turned away from the cairn, walking slowly into the soft bloom of a world remade not in rush, but in reverence, the last thread of silence loosened and lifted, joining the wind, the soil, the stars. The story had ended the way all sacred things do, not with a roar, but a return. The earth breathed, and would go on forever. And so it was, beneath skies neither young nor old, that breath and time converged in one final exhale. The earth, silenced once for 1,000,000 years, now pulsed in quiet perpetuity, not as a warning, nor as a triumph, but as a vow. Streams hummed with steady clarity, roots curled deeper into remembering soil, and the people of this reawakened world walked without maps, guided by rhythm alone. In one open field where fireflies bobbed like living embers of memory, an elder traced a circle in the dirt, then stepped back. No one stepped into it. No one disturbed it. Because they knew, by breath and by stillness, that some truths were not meant to be broken, only witnessed. Above them, the stars held their slow course, unconcerned with names, but aligned with meaning. The earth no longer reached, it received. Life no longer shouted, it harmonized. And in the pause between what was and what could still be, the final silence settled, not in absence, but in presence eternal. The 1,000,000-year breath had ended, not with eruption or song, but with being. And so the story, kept only by those willing to listen, became the world itself, alive, awake, and home at last. Beneath the glow of a crescent moon rising slow over hills softened by the breath of time, the land sighed, complete. No more would it need to pause to remember itself. No more would silence carry the weight of loss. The breath, once fractured across frost, famine, and forgetting, now flowed unbroken across all things, through roots and rivers, through antlered beasts and bare feet pressed to moss. In a glade cleared not by hands, but by patient seasons, the last candle flickered beside a ring of stones, not as warning, but as witness. Around it, no one stood, yet everyone remained. For the earth, now whole in rhythm, needed no monuments to mark its unpausing. Only motion, only memory, only the breath, long held and finally freed, rising forever into the still, star-watched night. A story not ended, only quietly, eternally lived. And in the hush beyond stories, past all flame and frost, the earth remained, not as myth, not as spectacle, but as breath embodied. The silence that once held the weight of extinction now traced the contours of belonging. Hills unraveled their shadows in slow dawn light, rivers dreamt across valleys carved by patience, and all who walked upon this great remembering did so with reverence in their souls. Nothing more was needed, no more signs, no more songs, for the song was everywhere, in wind, in water, in the shared pulse of life newly awakened and ancient beyond time. The breath, once halted a million years before, had found its pace again, not hurried, not forced, just true. And beneath stars that had witnessed both the pause and the return, the earth turned once more, not toward an end, but deeper into its own rhythm, sacred, seamless, and whole. And within that rhythm, the story found not a conclusion, but a final, living stillness. The kind that asks for no words, only breath. One more, and then another. So beneath sky woven from ancient stillness and dawnlight spun through the breath of countless lives, the earth settled into itself, not as a canvas for conquest, but as kin to those who walked it. No longer did survival demand its toll in fire and forgetting. Now, life moved gently across the land, tracing paths between memory and becoming. A child crouched at the meeting of stream and sun, watching the shimmer on water not with hunger, but with wonder. Behind her, others paused, listening to the rhythm that was not taught, only remembered. The earth, alive and breathing, in rhythms too slow for fear, too deep for words. And as the wind curled soft around them, lifting specks of pollen and dust like prayers long awaited, the story folded into stillness. Not an ending, but a breath. One that would begin again, again and again, stretched across time by those willing to walk quiet, plant deep, and listen long. The earth had remembered. And now, in figures of light and soil, so had we. And thus, beneath the canopy of stars that bore witness to all time before and all time yet to come, the earth settled and said no more. It did not need to. Its breath, long held and gently given back, now drifted through every tree, every ripple, every heartbeat sung into the soil by those who remembered how to listen. Nothing remained unfinished, nothing unexplained, for the story had not been written with ink or flame, but with a silence that endured until it was understood. A bird called softly into the dusk. A breeze shifted the ash of old fires. In a clearing that had once known only stillness, someone knelt and touched the ground, not to claim it, but to thank it. And in that final touch, drawn from memory rather than need, the earth breathed once more, and then simply was. Steady, whole, home. So let the breath continue, not as repetition, but as renewal, deep within soil and soul alike. Let it move through generations who do not name it, but live by it, who wake and walk and wonder in its rhythm. Let it drift through forests now thick with whispering life, through waters that cradle light across ages, through the pulse of a planet that once paused so the future could remember how to start again. There is no need to say it louder, for it is already everywhere, in the hush before dawn, in the warmth of shared steps, in the quiet between breaths. The earth did not vanish, nor return. It waited, and now it moves, whole, steady, awake. And in the steps of those who walk gently, who listen long, and who breathe in time with all that lives, the story lives too. No longer forgotten, no longer feared, only felt. A million-year breath, exhaled forever. There, in the silence between stars and soil, where all echoes fade into stillness and every breath folds into time, the earth holds its story without end. No more pages, no more prophets, only the steady rhythm of a world that once waited and now welcomes. Under branches bowed with memory, in shadows cast not by ruin but by rest, life continues, not to chase, not to conquer, but to belong. And as a final wind moved gently through grass risen from forgotten seed, tracing invisible paths around stone and stream, a presence lingered, not seen, but felt. The breath of a million years, finished once, begun again, now endlessly alive. The silence, once the shape of loss, had become the cradle of everything. And with that, the earth, whole, knowing, listening, breathed, not for the last time, but for always. And so, in the hush where breath met being and memory passed effortlessly into motion, the earth continued, not striving, not retreating, but becoming. The long silence, once mistaken for absence, had proved to be a seed, and from its stillness the world rose, not reborn, but remembered. In each step upon softened ground, in each glance shared beneath starlit canopies, the echo of survival transformed into presence. No more was life a reaction to loss. It was a reply to wonder. Beneath skies unmarred by urgency, the pulse endured, soft and steady. And as the wind moved once more, tender and sure, across fields no longer waiting, the final breath of that million-year silence folded into the rhythm of all things living. It was complete. It was endless. And the earth, held now in the cradle of its own continuity, exhaled one last time into eternity, not as farewell, but as a quiet, triumphant homecoming. The night deepened, but brought no fear, only the serenity of a world no longer holding itself apart. Beneath the folding dark, where trees stood like guardians of memory and rivers shimmered with the breath of stars, the earth no longer waited to speak. It simply was. A quiet presence now filled every hollow, every wind-carved stone, every echo passed from hand to hand beneath firelight. Laughter rose softly from clustered shelters built in harmony with root and ridge, and from the edge of a high bluff, a single voice sang, a low, wandering melody without shape, yet filled with knowing. Those who heard it said nothing, yet carried it inside them, not as history, but as home. And in the sky above, familiar and unfathomable, the stars gleamed down through eons, now mirrored in the still waters below. They had watched the earth pause. They now watched it live. The silence, once sovereign, now lay beneath the rhythm of a world remade not by force, but by breath. And so it ends, not in silence, but in the sound of life continuing, gently, forever. And even now, beneath the folds of time and stone, where roots tangle with memory and silence lingers like mist between generations, the breath goes on. No longer a question, no longer a weight, but a rhythm cradled in every living thing that walks, grows, rests. The earth, once so long withheld from itself, now opens with every dawn, exhaling gently into the hands that tend it without claim. There are no endings here, only continuance, in song, in soil, in the soft hush between footfall and flame. And as the final breath of silence dissolves forever into the warm air of a world fully remembered, what endures is not triumph or even story, but presence, that sacred, patient presence. The breath once paused is now the breath they all carry, together, endless. And in that breath, the earth does not end. It lives. And underneath moonlight woven from memory instead of light, across hills softened by centuries of breath finally set free, the earth did not declare an ending. It whispered a beginning that needed no voice. A newborn calf found standing beneath its mother, a tendril of vine curling around ancestral stone. A fire lit not to survive, but to gather. Each a quiet testament to what had endured. The long silence, once the measure of a world's suspended heart, had become the rhythm of living itself. Footsteps no longer echoed in emptiness. They wove into the land's own song. Above, stars reflected in tranquil waters, and in the eyes of those who now walked gently across the soil of their ancestors and descendants alike. No more breaths needed counting. No more stillness held fear. The earth breathed, fully, finally, and forever. And with it, every life sang not for the past left behind, but for the presence fully found. The story was not over. It was alive, infinite, and perfectly home. And so, in the breath-warmed hush of earth made whole again, where sky and soil no longer stood apart, the final rhythm settled. Not a finale, but a resting chord. The survivors, wanderers no more, had become something simpler, deeper. Participants in a shared existence written not in force, but in feeling. In a meadow where frost once ruled, they danced slowly beneath stars that had always watched, bearing no banner, no burden, only the deep peace of continuity. The earth, lungs open and listening, held their steps like a song retuned. And in each breath drawn there, unlabored and true, the long silence that once threatened to erase all life had found its answer. Not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in the quiet, breathing presence of a world that remembered how to live. And beneath those stars, ancient yet undimmed, the land came to rest in its rhythm, not with stillness, but with grace. In every gesture traced across bark, in every hush between waves lapping softened shores, The world hummed with memory made motion. The breath once held for 1,000,000 years now flowed without interruption, woven into roots and rivers, into hands that no longer carved survival, but communion. No monument stood. None was needed. The earth itself was the testament, living and ongoing. As dusk folded into dawn without fear, a final truth settled between soil and sky. The pause had never been an ending, only a preparation. And now, within the cadence of a planet no longer waiting, life, patient, present, and whole, went on. This was its legacy. This was its song. And the earth, breathing now as it forever would, needed no more to speak. It was heard. And in that final hush, where earth meets sky and memory gives way to breath, the story found rest, not in the closing of a chapter, but in the embracing of all that had come before. A wind moved through the valley, no longer a warning, but a lullaby, folding gently over hills seeded with promise. Those who walked this land no longer searched for signs. They had become them. Every footprint, every shared glance, every slow breath was now part of the earth's rhythm, no longer paused, no longer fractured. The silence that once held the weight of extinction had bloomed into presence, vast, quiet, alive. And so, without monument or farewell, without roar or revelation, the 1,000,000-year breath melted into the pulse of all things enduring. The earth lived. The silence listened. The breath went on, not as story, but as world. And as the final starlight wove itself into dawn's first sigh, the breath that had once stilled the earth dissolved into eternity. There, beneath a sky that no longer watched but welcomed, every rustling leaf, every flicker of flame, every quiet footfall spoke the same wordless truth. We are here. The silence had not been an absence, but a long and sacred preparation for renewal. And now, no longer fractured by frost nor bound by forgetting, the rhythm continued unbroken, carried in wind, in water, in the steady rise and fall of chest and soil. No end marked this moment, only belonging, vast and irrevocable. In the hush after history, in the warmth after cold, the earth breathed once more, not because it had to, but because it could. And so, without proclamation, without need, the story passed gently into the life it had made, whole, living, and forever home. And high within the curve of the awakening world, where mist kissed mountaintops and every horizon glowed with the memory of fire and frost, the earth continued, not in defiance, but in duet. Nothing more needed to change, for all that could be felt had been felt. All that could be remembered was now lived. Mountains no longer watched in silence. They held stories now, folded deep into stone. Rivers no longer whispered alone. They spoke in chorus with sky and soil, with hoof and hand. The breath once held for lifetimes uncounted now danced in every leaf and lingered in every step. And as the last light of day spilled gold across a path worn smooth by reverent feet, a figure paused, not to mark an ending, but to receive the horizon as it was. Open, vast, enough. The earth did not roar. It hummed. It endured. And in that enduring, the story found its final exhale. Not as a farewell, but as the simplest truth ever known. We lived. We breathed.
and we listened. And as the first echoes of night pressed gently across the valleys once veiled in eternal frost, the earth gave its last whisper, not as an echo, but as a promise. A hush settled, not from absence, but from reverence, as if the world itself bowed to the breath it now held freely. Above, the stars blinked in timeless rhythm, no longer mere watchers, but part of the breath itself. Eyes of silence cradling a planet that had finally come home to its own cadence. Beneath them, a single fire flickered in offering rather than need, its smoke rising with the ease of knowing. There were no words, no ends to speak, only this. The pause was sacred. The breath returned, and life, shaped by stillness and remembered by rhythm, endured not in memory, but in motion. The earth breathed, once, fully, and now forever, wrapped not in the roar of survival, but in the quiet, infinite belonging of those who listened, who waited, and who now walked humbly within the breath of a world awake. And in that breath, long returned and no longer rare, the earth became not just lived upon, but lived with. Every sound now, from branch creak to river sigh, folded into a larger voice, one not spoken, but sensed. Where silence once loomed as absence, it now lingered as presence. In a wide glen where fireflies spun sparks into the dusk and the air pulsed warm with contentment, 2 generations sat beneath the limbs of a tree born after the long stillness. Words were few, but breath was shared, as was the knowing that no storm need return, no frost need last forever. The earth, once stilled by time itself, moved gently now through them, around them, as part of them. And as the stars resumed their whispering across the boundless sky, one final truth anchored itself in soil, song, and skin. The breath that was once lost was never meant to return with fury, only with faith. And now, held in every root and rib and ripple, it did. Quietly, endlessly. Home. And so, as night unfolded its velvet hush across the hills, and the fires of one final camp burned low, the breath once held in waiting now rose without end into the stillness. No stories remained to be told, for the world itself had become the story, etched not in stone, but in the quiet ache of presence. Wind moved gently over resting shoulders, rustling leaves like soft applause for existence itself. Across every valley and rise, from cave shadow to canopy light, the earth no longer paused, no longer questioned. It simply was, awake, whole, and breathing with those who honored silence as the sacred path to belonging. In the arms of dusk, with echoes folded into wind and flame, the last chapter remained unwritten, because it did not need to be. The breath carried forward now lived in all things, infinite and indivisible. And as the stars dimmed gently into the promise of another dawn, the world closed its long-held silence with no sound at all, only the enduring rhythm of life, whispered into eternity. And so ends the silence that once blanketed the earth in stillness more ancient than memory, more patient than time. Beneath skies now softened by dawn's slow bloom, the land breathes without fear, without weight,
The breath once paused is now present in every tremble of leaf, every footfall pressed into living soil. No farewell is spoken, for none is needed. The story carries onward, not in voice, but in rhythm, unbreakable and inseparable from the world itself. Life remembers, not as it once was, but as it has become, shaped by hush, sustained by breath, and bound together in the simplest vow, to belong. And in that belonging, in that breath that will never be paused again, the earth continues, infinite, present, home.
And thus, just as quietly as it had begun, the story found its settling place among stars and soil, not as a conclusion, but as essence. The earth, once breathless for 1,000,000 years, moved now with a rhythm so complete it needed no name. No figure remained to mark its end, no inscription carved to capture its course. Only the breath lived on, folded into bark and heartbeat, into the hush between waves, into every moment shared in balance. This was the final inheritance, not tools or tales, but presence itself. And so, beneath ever-watching stars and upon land softened by memory and time, the earth breathed, not louder, not faster, just forever, in rhythm, in stillness, in peace. And in that final breath, drawn from earth and sky alike, everything simply was. The silence that once threatened to erase all memory had instead become the soil in which meaning took root. No more stories needed to be told, for the world itself had become the tale, unfolding not in chapters, but in wind and water, and the laughter of those who walked gently across its renewed skin. Beneath starlight that had outlived extinction, a single reed trembled beside a stream, its song soft, unshaped, eternal. And there, in the hush between all things, the breath continued, imperceptible to those who sought endings, thunderous to those who listened. The earth had stood still once, holding back its voice, waiting until reverence returned. Now, it breathed not in defiance of silence, but because of it. And in that breath, whispered beyond time, the story rested, forever alive. And so, under the final veil of twilight, where mist meets starlight and breath meets memory, the earth turned, not to conclude, but to carry on. No more hush, no more fracture, only rhythm, soft and solemn, woven into the marrow of stone and the hush of growing roots. A child lit a small fire beneath the outstretched limbs of an ancient tree, and as sparks shimmered skyward, she whispered nothing. For the world heard not through noise, but nearness. Around her, the valley did not speak, it listened. And as she leaned quietly into that presence, sky awake, soil warm, future unwritten but felt, the story folded gently into breath. Complete, not because it ended, but because it endured. In silence, in warmth, in every heartbeat that moved with the earth and no longer apart from it, until the stars dimmed, the soil sang, and the breath of 1,000,000 still years, became forever. And there, in the soft exhale beneath the evergreen canopy, where every shadow no longer signaled retreat but return, the earth found stillness not as absence, but as presence completed. A lone ember faded into the night, smoke curling into a sky thick with stars that no longer needed to bear witness. For the story they watched had finally
come home to rest. Beneath them, feet pressed into moss, breath rose into air, and silence, once held for 1,000,000 years, surrendered itself to the rhythm of life ongoing. The earth did not mark this ending with sound, for it was not an ending at all. It was a breath, full, final, and forever. And so the tale arrives not at its end, but at its belonging, settled quietly into every trembling petal, every breath curled beneath sky and root. The 1,000,000-year silence, once more vast than language, has given way to a world that remembers not how to conquer, but how to receive. Nothing will be forgotten, for all now lives within the rhythm, carried in footsteps laid gently upon softened earth, in flames lit for warmth, not warning, in breath drawn for harmony, not haste, beneath stars that gleam with the memory of all that was endured. The earth rests, not idle, but alive, whole in its return, unburdened by need for more. The breath once stilled has become the story, and the story, at last, is the breath. Forever quiet, forever home. And in this, the last hush, before nothing more need be said, a truth as old as the frost itself, settled into soil and skin alike. The earth had not ended when it stopped breathing. It had waited, taught by stillness, shaped by shadow, restored by the patience of life unhurried. Now every tide, every root, every hand that touched the land did so as part of that promise. To move gently, to listen freely, to become not masters, but mirrors of the breath they shared. There would be no final blaze, no closing voice, only this: a world made whole, not through force, but through forgiveness. And as the stars wheeled above, ancient and at ease, the earth offered its final gift, a breath, complete and unbroken, anchored in silence, carried forward in peace. The story needed no more words, only this breath, held forever in belonging. And so it is here, in this last breath folded into dusklight and drifting river mist, that the story finally rests. The earth, once silent long enough to reshape every memory, no longer seeks voice nor witness. It has become both. Beneath canopies reborn and skies free of sorrow, the rhythm no longer feared interruption. A single feather floated down through golden air, landing without sound at the foot of an old cairn now wrapped in moss. Nothing moved to mark it. Nothing needed to. For in that moment, weightless, perfect, complete, the breath that had once paused for 1,000,000 years lowered into the land as if laying down to sleep, not in fatigue, but fulfillment. No echo followed, no footstep stirred. Only the steady truth curled deep in the marrow of time. The earth had waited, had breathed, had remembered. And now, at last, it simply lived, endlessly, patiently, wholly, without need for more. And as night gathered its final calm across the sleeping valleys and breath-slick stones, the earth, now fully alive in silence and soil, closed the last unwritten verse. No final fire burned. No voice rose above the hush. Only the deep, unshakable rhythm of a world that had learned to move not faster, but truer. Beneath trees that once fractured in frost, and above rivers that once froze beneath stars, life now flowed with no intention but being. A child traced circles in soft dirt. A bird dreamed on a low limb, and in each of them the breath continued, effortless and sacred. The million-year pause had given way to presence, not marked by names or monuments, but held instead in the stillness between heartbeats. And in that sacred stillness, unmarred and unending, the earth remained, breathing, believing, becoming, forever. And so, as breath and time settled into one seamless rhythm, the earth that once stopped to relearn its pulse now moved endlessly forward, not chased by survival, but carried by presence. Beneath a sky woven with stars that no longer watched alone, life stirred in quiet constancy. There were no more questions left unanswered, only echoes held in soil, in water, in the hands that reached out not to shape, but to join. The breath, sacred and unbroken, flowed through every silence once feared and every chorus yet to come. In that final exhale folded into dawn's shimmer, the story did not end. It became everything. The world lived, the earth breathed, and at last, nothing more was needed.